Story 1. The bedroom door. The door was already moving. I woke up at exactly 3 in the morning because something felt wrong. It's not a sound, not a crash, not even a dream that I could remember. It was just that strange feeling you get when your brain notices something before the rest of you does. For a few seconds, I stayed completely still beneath the blankets, staring into the darkness of my room and trying to understand why I was suddenly awake. Then I noticed the door. My bedroom door was moving. At first, I thought I was imagining it. The room was dark, and the only light came from a street lamp outside that pushed a faint glow through the curtains. But once my eyes adjusted, I could see it clearly. The door was slowly swinging inward, not fast enough to make a sound, not fast enough to catch attention immediately, just inch by inch. I remember blinking several times and convincing myself that I must have forgotten to close it properly before going to bed. That explanation made sense. People forget small things all the time. I almost rolled over and went back to sleep, but something about the movement bothered me. The door wasn't drifting open the way a loose door normally would. It seemed steady, controlled, as if someone had opened it a little and then stopped. I watched the gap widen slightly, then slightly more. The house remained completely silent. I lived with my older brother at the time. He rented a 2-story house on the edge of a quiet neighborhood. His room was downstairs near the kitchen. Mine was upstairs at the end of a narrow hallway. The only other rooms on the second floor were a bathroom and a small storage room filled with boxes left behind by previous tenants. Nobody should have been upstairs. My brother worked early mornings and usually fell asleep before midnight. If he had somehow woken up and come upstairs, I would have heard him. The staircase creaked loudly under almost any weight. Even the 3rd step produced a sharp pop that echoed through the house. That night I had heard nothing. The door continued moving until it was open perhaps 8 inches. Then it stopped. I stared at it for what felt like several minutes, waiting for a face, a hand, or some explanation to appear in the gap. Nothing did. The hallway beyond remained dark and empty. That was when I checked my phone. The screen lit up the room just enough for me to see the time. For some reason, seeing the exact time made everything feel stranger. Most people have random stories about waking up during the night. But there is something unsettling about opening your eyes after 3 in the morning and finding evidence that something has already happened. Listened carefully. No television downstairs, no running water, no footsteps. Not even the sound of passing cars outside. Just silence. I kept watching. Small things stopped making sense. I eventually fell back asleep that night, though it took much longer than I wanted to admit. By morning, the entire situation felt less significant. Sunlight has a way of making strange things seem ordinary. When I came downstairs for breakfast, I told myself the door had probably been left unlatched. Houses shift, air moves through vents, old hinges behave strangely. That explanation satisfied me for exactly 1 day. The following evening, after getting home from work, I noticed the upstairs bathroom door was open. Normally that wouldn't have meant anything, except I distinctly remembered closing it before leaving that morning. I had done it without thinking. It was just part of my routine. I stood there for a moment, staring at the doorway. Then I shrugged and moved on. People misremember things all the time. At least that's what I kept telling myself. A couple of days later, I came downstairs and found the kitchen light on. My brother was already sitting at the table drinking coffee. "Did you leave that on all night?" I asked. He looked over his shoulder. "What light?" "The kitchen." He frowned. "No, you're sure?" "Positive." I switched it off and thought nothing more about it. But later that day, I remembered something. The kitchen light switch was located near the back door. Neither of us used that door very often. We almost always entered through the garage. The light had no reason to be on. Still, it wasn't proof of anything. 1 light, 1 open door. Small things. The kind of things people forget? The problem was that the small things kept happening. 3 days after that, I found the storage room upstairs standing partially open. That room bothered me more than the others. Unlike the bathroom or kitchen, nobody used it. The previous owners had left random furniture, old boxes, and broken shelves inside. I hadn't stepped into the room since moving in, yet there it was, open. Not wide open. Just enough to notice. I remember standing in the hallway looking at the dark gap between the door and frame. Strange feeling settled into my stomach. Not fear exactly. It's discomfort. The kind that appears before your brain understands why. I walked over and pushed the door closed. The hinges creaked softly. Then I returned to my room. That night I slept with my bedroom door completely shut. The next morning, it was still shut. For a moment, I felt relieved. Then things got worse. We had a dog named Bailey. He was an older golden retriever who spent most of his time sleeping. Bailey rarely reacted to anything. Thunderstorms didn't bother him. Fireworks barely got his attention. One evening while I was watching television downstairs, I noticed him standing in the hallway. He wasn't moving. He wasn't barking, he was simply staring. The hallway led toward the staircase. I called his name. Nothing. His ears twitched slightly, but his eyes never left the darkness beyond. I got up and walked over. The moment I approached, Bailey turned around and followed me into the living room, as though nothing had happened. A few nights later, he did it again. This time he stood at the bottom of the stairs, watching, waiting. His posture wasn't aggressive. If anything, he looked confused. That unsettled me more. Dogs usually react to things. They bark, they growl, they investigate. Bailey just stared. Over the next week, I started noticing how often I was checking things. The front door lock, the back door lock, the windows. I would lock everything before bed, walk upstairs, then come back down 10 minutes later just to make sure. Nothing was ever wrong. Everything remained locked. Everything remained secure. Yet every night I felt slightly less comfortable inside my own house. The incidents were too small to explain to anyone without sounding ridiculous. An open door, a light left on, dogs staring into darkness. Individually, they meant nothing. Together they created a feeling I couldn't shake. A feeling that something inside the house wasn't behaving the way it should. The longer I ignored it, the harder that feeling became to dismiss. Someone was walking upstairs about a week after I started noticing the strange little incidents around the house. I woke up in the middle of the night again. At first, I wasn't even sure what had disturbed me. The room was dark. The digital clock beside my bed showed 2:43 a.m. I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the familiar silence of the house. Then I heard it. Soft creak. I immediately thought of the staircase. Every house has its own sounds, and after living there for several months, I had become familiar with most of them. The heating system clicked occasionally. Pipes made noises when temperatures changed. The wooden floors settled at night. This sounded different. A few seconds later, another creak echoed somewhere above me. I froze. My bedroom was located directly beneath the unfinished storage space that stretched across part of the second-floor ceiling. It wasn't an attic exactly. It's more like a narrow crawl area used for storage. Access to it was through a small door inside the storage room at the end of the hallway. Nobody ever went up there. In fact, I wasn't sure my brother had even looked inside it since we moved in. I listened carefully. Nothing. The silence returned. I let out a slow breath and rolled onto my side. Then came another sound. This time it wasn't a creak. It was a step, a faint but unmistakable shift of weight against wood. My eyes opened immediately. I remained perfectly still. A few moments later, another one followed. Slow, measured, as if someone was walking cautiously across the floor above my bedroom. I sat up. The sound stopped. Instantly, the silence that followed felt heavier than before. I stayed upright for nearly a minute, listening. Nothing happened. Eventually, I convinced myself I was being ridiculous. Old houses make noises. Wood expands and contracts. The human brain is excellent at turning random sounds into patterns. Feeling slightly embarrassed, I lay back down. Less than 30 seconds later, the footsteps returned. One, then another, then another. Not loud, not dramatic. Just enough to suggest movement. Sighed up again. Silence. That was the first moment I felt genuinely uncomfortable, not frightened, just unsettled. The pattern repeated several times that night. Whenever I lay down, the sounds eventually resumed. Whenever I sat up and listened, they stopped. By 4 in the morning, I was exhausted. At some point, I finally fell asleep, convincing myself that I had imagined most of it. The next day, I nearly forgot about the experience. Work kept me busy. Sunlight made everything seem less threatening. And yet when I returned home that evening, I found myself looking toward the upstairs hallway more often than usual. The storage room door was closed. everything appeared normal. That night, I went to bed expecting nothing. The footsteps started again shortly after 3. This time there was no confusion. I was awake enough to know exactly what I was hearing. Someone or something seemed to be moving slowly across the area above my ceiling. I considered waking my brother, several times, actually. But every explanation sounded ridiculous. What was I supposed to tell him? That the house was making noises? That I thought someone was walking around inside a storage space nobody used? Instead, I stayed in bed and listened. The sounds continued for nearly an hour. Sometimes they were spaced several minutes apart. Sometimes they came in short clusters. A few slow steps, a pause, then more. The strangest part wasn't the noise itself. It was the feeling that developed alongside it, a feeling I couldn't explain logically. Footsteps never sounded random. They sounded aware, as though whoever was moving above me knew exactly where my room was. Over the following nights, sleep became increasingly difficult. I found myself staring at the ceiling long after midnight, waiting, listening, anticipating the next sound. Bailey began behaving strangely too. More than once I caught him sitting at the bottom of the stairs after dark, looking upward, not barking, not growling, just staring. The same way he stared down hallways, the same way he stared into empty rooms. And every time I saw him do it, that uncomfortable feeling returned. The feeling that something was present even when I couldn't see it. By the end of the week, I had stopped worrying about doors and lights. Something else occupied my thoughts now. Because every night, right around the same time, footsteps appeared above my bedroom. And every night, they felt a little closer. The missing hour, the footsteps continued for several more nights. By then, they had become part of a routine I hated but couldn't escape. I would go to bed exhausted, tell myself I wasn't going to think about them, and then lie awake waiting for the first sound from above my ceiling. Some nights they came, some nights they didn't. The inconsistency somehow made everything worse. At least if the noises happened every night, I could convince myself there was a mechanical explanation. Maybe a loose beam, maybe changing temperatures, maybe something settling inside the walls. Instead, the sounds seemed unpredictable, and that made them feel intentional. About 2 weeks after the bedroom door first opened by itself, I experienced something that bothered me far more than the footsteps. I woke up feeling exhausted, not normal tired. Not the kind of tired that comes from staying up too late. It felt different. It felt as though I hadn't slept at all. My eyes were heavy. My head ached. Every part of my body felt sluggish. For a few moments I stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling. The room looked normal. The morning light was filtering through the curtains. Nothing appeared unusual. Then I reached for my phone. The screen showed 7:52 a.m. Immediately something felt wrong. I always set an alarm for 6:45. Always. I checked the alarm history. It had gone off. I had apparently turned it off. Yet I had absolutely no memory of hearing it. None. That alone wasn't impossible. People occasionally sleep through alarms. What bothered me was the complete absence of memory between the middle of the night and that moment. It felt like an entire section of time had simply vanished. I tried not to think about it, got dressed, brushed my teeth, and prepared for work. Then I noticed my desk chair. It was angled slightly away from the desk. Normally, that wouldn't mean anything, except I was obsessive about keeping things organized. Every night before bed, I pushed the chair neatly underneath the desk. The chair wasn't far away, it's only a foot or two, but it immediately caught my attention. I stood there staring at it, trying to remember whether I had moved it. I couldn't. An uncomfortable feeling settled into my stomach. I looked around the room. At first, everything seemed normal. Then I noticed my television remote sitting on the opposite side of the dresser. My water bottle was closer to the edge of the nightstand than I remembered. A hoodie I had left hanging over a chair was now draped differently. None of these things proved anything. Individually, they were meaningless. Yet together, they created a strange impression that someone had entered the room, that I had been awake during the night and forgotten it completely. Neither explanation felt good. That evening after work, I stopped by an electronics store and bought a small indoor security camera. I told myself it was just for peace of mind. The camera wasn't pointed directly into my bedroom. Instead, I mounted it on a shelf in the upstairs hallway. Its view covered the hallway outside my room, the bathroom door, and most of the area leading toward the storage room. I figured if someone was somehow moving around upstairs, the camera would catch it. For the first time in days, I felt slightly reassured. The setup was simple. Motion detection, night vision, cloud recording, nothing fancy. Before going to bed, I checked every lock in the house twice. Then I went upstairs. My bedroom door was closed. The hallway was empty. The camera's small status light blinked quietly from across the hall. Everything looked normal. That night I slept surprisingly well. No footsteps, no strange sounds, no sudden awakenings. When morning arrived, I felt almost embarrassed by how paranoid I had become. I grabbed my phone and opened the camera app while making coffee downstairs. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The hallway remained empty throughout most of the night. Hours passed with no recorded activity. Then I reached a motion alert timestamped 3:11 a.m. I tapped it. The black and white night vision footage appeared. The hallway was silent and empty. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then my stomach dropped. My bedroom door slowly began to open. Not all at once, not quickly. Exactly the way I had seen it on that first night. The gap widened inch by inch. The door continued moving until it was partially open, and it stopped. I watched the footage twice, 3 times. There was nobody visible in the hallway. Nothing appeared on camera. No shadow, no hand, no figure. Just the door opening by itself. Then, after nearly 3 minutes, it slowly closed again. I immediately checked the rest of the recording. The problem was the camera angle. It's from where it was mounted. It couldn't see inside my room. It's only the hallway outside. Whatever caused the door to open remained hidden beyond the frame. And for the first time since this began, I found myself asking a question I had been avoiding. What if the thing I needed to worry about wasn't in the hallway at all? The closet. I spent the entire day thinking about the footage. No matter how many times I replayed it, the result was always the same. My bedroom door opened in the middle of the night and then closed again. There was no visible person in the hallway. No obvious explanation, just movement. By lunchtime, I had convinced myself there had to be a logical reason. Maybe the door wasn't latching properly. Maybe air pressure from the vents was causing it to move. Maybe I was allowing several unrelated events to blend together into something bigger than they actually were. The problem was that none of those explanations accounted for the feeling I had developed over the previous 2 weeks. It's a feeling that something wasn't right. By the time I got home from work, I had made up my mind. I was going to search the entire house, not casually, not the quick walkthrough I usually did before bed. I meant every room, every closet, every corner. I wanted a reason for everything that had been happening. The moment I walked through the front door, I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer. Bailey followed me as I moved through the house. The first floor took less than 20 minutes. I checked every room, every closet, every cabinet large enough to hide someone. Nothing. The house looked exactly as it always had. For a brief moment, I felt ridiculous. I imagined trying to explain the situation to another person. My bedroom door moved. A few lights turned on. My dog stared at hallways. It sounded absurd. I almost laughed at myself. Then I headed upstairs. The second floor felt different that evening. Not because anything had changed, because I was actively looking. Every shadow seemed darker. Every corner attracted my attention. The bathroom was empty. My bedroom was exactly as I had left it. I left the storage room. I stood outside the door for several seconds before opening it. I wasn't expecting to find anything. At least that's what I kept telling myself. The room smelled faintly of dust and old wood. Boxes lined the walls. A broken bookshelf leaned in one corner. Several pieces of furniture left by previous tenants sat covered beneath faded sheets. My flashlight swept slowly across the room. Nothing immediately stood out. Then I remembered the small access door. It was located near the back wall behind a stack of cardboard boxes. The door led into the unfinished storage space above part of the second floor. It's the same area where I had been hearing footsteps. A cold feeling settled into my stomach. I moved the boxes aside. The access door was already slightly open. Not wide, just enough to notice. I froze. I couldn't remember whether it had always been that way. Maybe it had. Maybe it hadn't. The uncertainty bothered me. Slowly, I pulled the door open wider and aimed my flashlight inside. The beam illuminated exposed wooden beams and insulation. At first glance, everything appeared normal. Then I climbed inside. The space wasn't large enough to stand upright. I had to crouch as I moved forward. Dust coated most surfaces. The air felt stale. The silence pressed heavily against my ears. For several moments I saw nothing unusual. Then my flashlight landed on an area near the far wall. I stopped moving. Something was wrong. The dust there had been disturbed. Not recently enough to look fresh, but recently enough to stand out. The difference was obvious. Most of the floor carried an even layer of dust. That section didn't. I moved closer. My heart began beating faster. Near the wall sat an old blanket. It wasn't folded, it wasn't stored, it was crumpled. The way a blanket looks after someone has been using it. I stared at it for several seconds, trying to convince myself there was another explanation. Maybe workers had left it behind. Maybe previous tenants had forgotten it. Then I noticed something beside it. Food wrappers. Several of them. Empty snack packages. A plastic water bottle. Small things, but enough. Enough to destroy every comforting explanation I had built over the previous weeks. I remember feeling a sudden rush of adrenaline. The kind that makes your skin feel cold. Someone had been up there, not years ago, recently. The blanket wasn't buried beneath dust. The wrappers weren't old enough to belong to previous owners. Somebody had been spending time inside that space. Possibly for days, possibly longer. I immediately backed toward the access door. My flashlight swept across every corner as I moved. Every shadow suddenly seemed threatening. Every dark gap looked capable of hiding a person. The worst part wasn't what I found. It was what I didn't find. There was nobody there. No sound. No movement. No sign of where they had gone. Just evidence that someone had been living inside a hidden space above my bedroom. And the terrifying realization that if they had been there before, they could come back again. I never found out the first thing I did after climbing out of that storage space was call the police. I didn't know what else to do. Within an hour, 2 officers arrived and searched the house. I showed them the blanket, the wrappers, the water bottle, and the area where everything had been found. They took photographs and asked questions about the strange events I had experienced over the previous few weeks. The search lasted nearly 2 hours. They checked the attic space, the yard, the garage, and every room in the house. They found nothing. No fingerprints that led anywhere. No identification. No sign of who had been staying there. According to the officers, it wasn't impossible for someone to have been living in the space without our knowledge. It happened occasionally in vacant buildings and rental properties, but without actually finding the person, there wasn't much they could do. That answer didn't make me feel any better. What made things even stranger was what happened afterward. Everything stopped. The open doors stopped. The lights stayed off. Bailey stopped staring into hallways. Most importantly, the footsteps above my bedroom disappeared completely. Night after night, the house remained silent. It was as though whatever had been happening ended the moment I discovered that hidden area. My brother and I moved out several months later when the lease expired. Neither of us wanted to stay. Even though nothing else occurred, the feeling never fully left. Years have passed since then. I've lived in other houses and other apartments. I have security cameras now. Check locks before bed. And every so often, usually late at night, I find myself thinking about that video. The one showing my bedroom door slowly opening before closing again. Maybe there was a simple explanation. Maybe there wasn't. What still bothers me isn't the possibility that somebody was inside the house. It's the timeline. The blanket, the wrappers, and the disturbed dust proved someone had been there. What I never learned was how long. A few days would have been unsettling. A few weeks would have been worse. But sometimes I wonder if they had been there for months, quietly watching our routines, moving through the house when nobody noticed. And that possibility is the part that still keeps me awake. Story 2. The apartment across the courtyard, the woman who never looked away. I first noticed her about 3 weeks after moving into the apartment complex. At the time, there was nothing particularly strange about it. The building was arranged around a small central courtyard with a handful of trees, a few benches, and a narrow walkway connecting the parking area to the entrances. My apartment sat on the second floor, facing directly across the courtyard, toward another building that looked almost identical. Most evenings followed the same routine. I would come home from work, make dinner, watch television for a while, and eventually sit near the living room window before bed. It wasn't a spectacular view, but it was quiet. One night, while scrolling through my phone, I happened to glance outside and noticed a woman standing at a window in the building across from mine. She appeared to be around middle age, maybe older. It was difficult to tell from that distance. The light behind her was dim, turning her mostly into a silhouette. I remember looking at her for only a few seconds before returning my attention to my phone. People stand near windows all the time. There was nothing unusual about it. The next evening, I saw her again. She was standing in exactly the same spot. Her posture looked identical. Her arms rested at her sides. Her face appeared directed toward the courtyard below. Again, I didn't think much of it. Maybe she enjoyed people watching. Maybe she liked fresh air. Everyone has habits. Over the following week, however, I began noticing something odd. Every time I looked toward that apartment late at night, she was there. Not occasionally, not most nights. Every night. Always standing at the same window. Always facing outward. Always motionless. The first few times I caught myself staring, I felt slightly embarrassed. I didn't want to become the strange neighbor who watched other residents through their windows. Still, curiosity has a way of building when something repeats often enough. One night I intentionally checked. Around 11:30 she was there. At midnight she was still there. At 12:30 she hadn't moved. I eventually went to bed. The next morning the window was empty. The pattern continued. Night after night the woman appeared. Sometimes I noticed her while making coffee. Sometimes while watching television. Sometimes while turning off lights before bed. No matter when I looked, she seemed to be standing in exactly the same place. The thing that bothered me wasn't her presence. It was her stillness. Most people shift their weight, check their phones, walk away and return. She didn't, at least not when I was watching. One Friday night, I sat near my window for nearly 40 minutes. The woman remained completely motionless the entire time. Not a single visible movement. No adjustment. No turn of her head. Nothing. When I finally stood up to close the curtains, I felt an uncomfortable sensation I couldn't quite explain. The courtyard below was quiet. The surrounding apartments were mostly dark. And across from me, framed by a dim yellow light, the woman remained standing at that same window, looking outward, waiting, as though she had nowhere else to be. The pattern, the longer I lived there, the harder it became to ignore the woman across the courtyard. At first, she had simply been a strange detail in the background of my evenings, something I noticed occasionally while watching television or checking my phone. But as the weeks passed, I started paying attention to her without meaning to. The pattern was impossible to miss. Every night, sometime between 10 and 11, she appeared at the same window. Every morning, she was gone. No exceptions. I began checking almost automatically. If I got home late from work, I would glance across the courtyard while unlocking my door. There she was. If I woke up during the night and wandered into the kitchen for water, I would look through the living room window. Still there? Always standing. Always facing outward. The strangest part was that I never saw her arrive. I never saw her leave.
Oh.
She simply seemed to exist in that window after dark, then disappear before sunrise. One Saturday evening, curiosity got the better of me. I decided to keep track. At 10:17 p.m., she was standing there. At 11:03 p.m., she hadn't moved. At 11:51 p.m., she was still there. Midnight, 12:30, 1:05. Nothing changed. The entire time she remained in exactly the same position. The dim light behind her never switched off. The silhouette never shifted. Eventually, I became tired and went to bed. The next morning, I checked before making coffee.
Oh, the window was empty.
No light. No figure. Nothing. A few days later, I mentioned her to another tenant while checking my mail. The man lived on the first floor and had been there for years. We talked casually for a few minutes before I pointed toward the apartment across the courtyard. "You know the woman who stands at that window every night?" I asked. He looked where I was pointing, then looked back at me. "What woman?" "The one in the apartment across from mine." He frowned. "There isn't anybody living there." I laughed. At first I thought he was joking. "I'm serious. So am I." He shrugged. "That unit's been empty for months." I remember staring at him, waiting for him to smile. He didn't. The conversation moved on, but the comment stayed with me. That night, I found myself watching the window more closely than ever. At 10:42 p.m., the woman appeared again, exactly as before, standing motionless behind the glass. The apartment certainly didn't look abandoned. There was light inside. There was clearly a person standing there, yet the tenant had sounded completely certain. Over the next 2 weeks, I asked 3 other residents, not directly. I tried to bring it up naturally. The answers were surprisingly similar. One woman thought the apartment was vacant. Another said she hadn't seen anyone move in. A third claimed maintenance workers occasionally entered the unit, but nobody actually lived there. Each conversation left me more confused. I started wondering whether I had misunderstood something. Maybe the apartment number was different than I thought. Maybe I was looking at the wrong window. Maybe a new tenant had moved in quietly. Those explanations should have reassured me. Instead, they somehow made everything worse. Every night, the same routine continued. The woman appeared. The courtyard grew quiet. Surrounding apartments darkened one by one. And there she remained, watching. Not watching me specifically. At least not yet. Just standing there for hours at a time. The longer I observed her, the more unnatural her stillness seemed. Human beings move constantly. Even when standing still, we shift our weight, adjust our posture, look around. She didn't. Some nights I would stare at her for several minutes, waiting for the slightest movement. A turn of the head, a raised arm, anything. Most of the time, nothing happened. Eventually, I stopped worrying about whether she actually lived there. A different question had started bothering me. If nobody rented that apartment, then who was standing in the window every single night? And why did it feel like she wanted to be seen? The wrong apartment? By that point, the woman had become impossible to ignore. What started as mild curiosity had slowly transformed into something much stronger. I wasn't obsessed with the apartment across the courtyard, but I thought about it far more than I wanted to admit. Every explanation I came up with seemed reasonable until I looked out the window and saw her standing there again. Then none of them felt convincing anymore. Eventually, I decided to get a definitive answer. A few days later, I stopped by the management office after work. I tried to make the conversation sound casual. At first, I asked a few questions about parking permits and maintenance requests. Then I mentioned the apartment across from mine. The woman behind the desk pulled up a map of the complex. I pointed directly at the unit. "Does somebody live there?" I asked. She glanced at the screen. No, the answer came so quickly that I thought she might have misunderstood. "The apartment facing Building C," I asked. She nodded. "That unit is vacant." "For how long?" She checked again. "About 7 months." I felt a strange sensation in my chest. Not fear exactly, more like confusion. "You're sure?" She looked at me curiously. "Positive." I thanked her and left. The entire walk back to my apartment felt surreal. Part of me wanted to dismiss everything immediately. Maybe I had been looking at the wrong apartment all along. Maybe the angle from my window created some kind of confusion. Maybe there was another unit nearby that I had mistaken for the vacant one. The moment I got home, I checked. The woman was already there, standing in the exact same window, the exact same apartment, the supposedly empty apartment. That night, I couldn't focus on anything else. I kept finding excuses to glance outside. Every time I looked, she remained in place, motionless, silent, watching the courtyard. At least that's what I assumed. Over the next week, I began paying much closer attention. I stopped casually noticing her and started actively observing her. I watched from different angles inside my apartment. I checked at different times. I even used binoculars once. The distance was too great to reveal many details, but it allowed me to confirm something unsettling. She never seemed to be doing anything. No television glow, no phone, no book. No visible activity, just standing. Night after night, the longer I watched, the stranger the situation became. Sometimes I would look away for 10 minutes and expect her to be gone. She never was. Sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night and immediately check the window. She was always there. The repetition itself became disturbing. Human behavior isn't usually that consistent. People get distracted. They become bored. They move around. She didn't. One Thursday evening, everything changed. I had fallen asleep on the couch while watching a movie. Sometime after midnight, I woke up and noticed the television was still on. The apartment was quiet. sat the courtyard sat beneath a pale glow from several overhead lights. Out of habit, I looked across toward the vacant apartment. The woman was standing there. For a moment, nothing seemed different, and I felt a sudden chill. I sat upright. Something about her position had changed. Not much, just enough. Till that night, she had always appeared to be facing outward toward the courtyard below. Now she seemed angled differently. I couldn't explain it immediately. I stared for several seconds before realizing why it felt wrong. She wasn't looking down anymore. She was looking straight ahead, directly across the courtyard, directly toward my building, my apartment, my living room window. A cold feeling spread through my stomach. The distance made it impossible to see her face clearly, yet the impression was unmistakable. For the first time since I had noticed her, it felt as though she wasn't simply standing at the window. It felt as though she was watching me. I stepped sideways away from the glass. The movement was instinctive. The kind of reaction that happens before you consciously decide to do it. Then I looked back. She hadn't moved. She remained exactly where she was, still, silent, facing my direction. Oh. And for the rest of that night, no matter how many times I checked, she never seemed to look anywhere else. The flashlight after the night I became convinced the woman was looking directly at my apartment. My routine changed completely. I started closing my curtains earlier, not because I truly believed I was being watched, but because I couldn't shake the feeling that I was participating in something I didn't understand. Every evening I told myself I wasn't going to check the window. Every evening, I checked anyway. The woman never failed to appear, the same window, the same apartment, the same motionless silhouette. The consistency of it all became exhausting. I found myself thinking about her at work, wondering who she was, wondering why nobody else seemed to notice her, wondering whether I was somehow misinterpreting everything. Then came the storm. The weather had been threatening rain all afternoon. By evening, dark clouds covered the sky, and strong winds rattled the trees around the complex. Around 10 o'clock, rain began striking the windows. By 11, the storm had become severe. Thunder rolled across the buildings. Branches swayed violently in the courtyard below. Most residents seemed to have gone to bed early. The majority of windows were dark. I was sitting on my couch watching the rain when the power suddenly went out. The television died instantly. The room fell into darkness. For a moment, the entire complex seemed frozen, and emergency lights illuminated parts of the parking lot, casting faint shadows across the courtyard. I sighed and grabbed a flashlight from a kitchen drawer. The outage didn't worry me. Storms occasionally caused power failures in the area. Usually they lasted less than an hour. I returned to the living room and sat near the window, without the usual apartment lights. The courtyard looked completely different, darker, larger. The trees moved violently in the wind, their branches twisting beneath flashes of distant lightning. For several minutes, I simply watched the storm. Then I found myself looking toward the apartment again. Even before raising the flashlight, I could see the silhouette. The woman was still there, despite the blackout, despite the storm, standing in the same window, motionless. A strange feeling settled into my stomach. Every other apartment facing the courtyard had gone dark. Every other resident seemed to have disappeared into the night. Yet she remained. The silhouette was faint now, visible only when occasional lightning illuminated the building. I don't know exactly why I did what happened next. Maybe curiosity, maybe frustration, maybe the simple desire to finally get a better look. Whatever the reason, I raised the flashlight and swept the beam across the courtyard. At first I wasn't aiming at her. I was examining the trees and pathways below. The beam moved across benches, bushes, the brick walls of the opposite building. Then it passed over the window. The light struck the glass directly, for less than a second, but it was enough. I immediately froze. The flashlight remained pointed at the window. My heart began beating faster. Something wasn't right. For weeks I had assumed the woman was standing somewhere inside the apartment, several feet behind the glass. That was how people normally stand near windows. The flashlight revealed otherwise. She wasn't standing back in the room. She wasn't standing near furniture. She wasn't even standing a few feet from the glass. She was almost pressed against it. The realization hit me instantly. The silhouette filled far more of the window than it should have. Much closer than I had ever imagined. As if she had been standing directly behind the pane the entire time. Watching through it, The beam trembled slightly in my hand. I took a step closer to my own window. The light continued illuminating her. The details remained difficult to make out through the rain and distance. Yet I could see enough to realize the figure wasn't positioned naturally. Most people lean against windows, rest a hand on the frame, shift their posture. She seemed rigid, unmoving, almost flattened against the glass. Another flash of lightning illuminated the courtyard. For a brief moment, the entire building appeared bright white, and during that instant, I thought I saw her face. Not clearly. Just enough to notice how close it was. Far too close. The image vanished immediately when darkness returned. I lowered the flashlight. A chill crawled through my body. Everything about the sight felt wrong. Not impossible, just wrong. Like discovering a photograph where someone is standing slightly closer to the camera than they should be. A small detail that completely changes how the image feels. The rain continued pounding against the buildings. Thunder echoed overhead. Across the courtyard, the figure remained perfectly still, standing against the glass, watching. And for the first time since this began, I felt something stronger than curiosity. I felt fear, because whatever explanation I had been hoping to find suddenly seemed much less likely than before. The maintenance key, I barely slept after the storm. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the image of the woman standing against the glass. The closer I examined the memory, the less comfortable I became. For weeks I had assumed there was a simple explanation, a strange neighbor, an unusual routine, someone with a habit of standing at a window for long periods. After the flashlight illuminated the apartment, that explanation felt much harder to believe. The figure had been too close, much too close. And the image of that face, however brief it had been, continued replaying in my mind. The following afternoon, I decided I needed answers, not guesses, not theories, answers. I returned to the management office and explained the situation as carefully as possible. I avoided mentioning anything supernatural. Instead, I focused on the facts. I told them I had repeatedly seen someone inside a supposedly vacant apartment. At first, the manager looked skeptical. Then she became concerned. If somebody had somehow gained access to an empty unit, that would be a serious problem. After a short discussion, she agreed to have a maintenance worker inspect the apartment. I asked if I could come along. To my surprise, she agreed. An hour later, I met the maintenance worker outside the building. He introduced himself as Greg, a man in his 50s who looked thoroughly unimpressed by the entire situation. As we crossed the courtyard, I couldn't stop looking toward the window. In daylight, the apartment appeared completely ordinary. The curtains were open. The glass reflected the cloudy sky. Nothing about it seemed unusual. Greg unlocked the main entrance. The hallway smelled faintly of cleaning supplies and old carpet. We climbed one flight of stairs before stopping outside the apartment door. I felt strangely nervous. Part of me expected everything to be explained the moment we stepped inside. The other part wasn't sure what to expect at all. Greg inserted a key and opened the door. The apartment was dark. Not dim. Dark. The kind of darkness that comes from a place untouched for a long time. We stepped inside. The first thing I noticed was the silence. The second was the emptiness. There was nothing there. No couch, no table, no television, no decorations, no signs of life whatsoever. The rooms were completely vacant. Dust covered the floors. The walls were bare. The air smelled stale. I slowly moved through the apartment while Greg checked windows and light switches. None of the lights worked. The power had apparently been disconnected months earlier. A detail bothered me immediately. Every night I had seen illumination behind the woman, yet there was no electricity, no functioning lamps. Nothing. The apartment contained absolutely no evidence that anyone lived there. No food, no clothing, no personal belongings, nothing. For several minutes I felt almost relieved. Maybe I had misunderstood everything. Maybe the reflections at night created some strange optical illusion. Maybe the figure had never been inside this apartment at all. Then I reached the room facing the courtyard. The room with the window. I stopped walking. Greg noticed, and followed my gaze downward. The dust on the floor had been disturbed. Not everywhere, only in one section. A narrow trail crossed the room. Footprints, fresh footprints. The marks were obvious against the layer of dust surrounding them. They began near the doorway, then continued directly toward the window. I stared at them without speaking. The maintenance worker crouched down. "That's strange," he muttered. The footprints appeared relatively recent, days old at most, maybe less. The dust around them remained untouched. The trail moved in a straight line toward the glass, toward the exact location where I had seen the woman standing every night. A cold feeling spread through my chest. I followed the prints carefully, one after another, across the room, toward the window, toward the place where the figure should have been standing. Then something happened that made my stomach drop. The footprints ended, not gradually, not by turning around, they simply stopped. The final print sat less than a foot from the glass. Beyond it, there was nothing. No return trail, no second set of prints. No indication that whoever walked there had ever walked away. The dust remained completely undisturbed. I remember looking back toward the doorway, then toward the window, and back to the footprints again and again, trying desperately to find a reasonable explanation. But the floor showed only one path, K, a path leading directly to the window, and no path leading away. Neither of us said much as we stood there staring at the dust, because regardless of what had caused them, those footprints created a question neither of us could answer. Someone had walked to that window. The problem was that there was no evidence they had ever left.
The knocking the next day was uneventful. I spent most of the afternoon clearing fallen branches from a trail and checking parts of the property that hadn't been visited in months. Being outside helped. In daylight, the woods seemed ordinary. The strange shape I thought I had seen at the window felt less significant with every passing hour. By sunset, I had almost convinced myself that I had imagined it. Then night came. The cabin felt different after dark. Not dangerous. Just isolated in a way that was difficult to ignore. Once the sun disappeared, the surrounding forest became a wall of blackness pressing against the edges of the clearing. The nearest house was miles away. If someone called for help out there, nobody would hear it. I tried not to think about that as I settled in for the evening. Around 9 o'clock, I heard the first knock. It was soft, so soft that I initially thought it had come from inside the cabin. I looked up from the television and listened. Nothing. The silence returned. A few minutes later, I heard it again. Knock, knock. Not loud enough to sound urgent, just loud enough to get my attention. I muted the television and waited. The sound didn't repeat. Eventually I stood up and checked the front porch. Nobody was there. The clearing appeared empty beneath the porch light. I returned inside, feeling slightly embarrassed. About half an hour later, another sound came from outside. This time, it wasn't a knock. It sounded like footsteps moving through dry leaves. Slow, deliberate, circling somewhere beyond the cabin. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The noise stopped immediately. The silence that followed felt almost unnatural. I swept the beam across the trees. Nothing. No animals. No people. No movement at all. As soon as I went back inside, the sounds eventually returned. A faint rustle, a few slow steps, then silence whenever I investigated. The pattern continued throughout the evening. Each incident by itself seemed harmless. The face returns, the weather changed during the following evening. Dark clouds rolled in shortly before sunset, and by nightfall a steady rain had begun falling across the property. Wind pushed through the trees surrounding the cabin, causing branches to scrape softly against one another. I hoped the storm would explain some of the noises I had been hearing. After all, wind and rain could create all kinds of strange sounds in a place like that. For a while, it seemed I was right. The knocking never came. The footsteps never returned. The weather filled the night with enough noise to drown out everything else. Around 11 o'clock, I was sitting on the couch, reading, while rain tapped against the windows. The cabin felt almost comfortable again. Then lightning flashed. The room brightened for an instant. I barely noticed. A few minutes later, another flash lit up the clearing outside. This time my eyes drifted toward the side window, and I froze. There was a face pressed against the glass. Pale, motionless. Close enough that it filled most of the window. The image lasted less than a second before darkness returned. I shot to my feet. My heart slammed against my chest. For a moment I simply stood there, staring at the black window. I questioned what I had seen immediately. The flash had been brief. Maybe it was a reflection. Maybe my mind had turned shadows into something human. Then another flash illuminated the clearing. The window was empty. That should have reassured me. Instead, it convinced me that something had been there moments earlier. Without thinking, I grabbed a flashlight and hurried outside. Rain soaked my clothes almost instantly. I swept a beam across the clearing and the nearby trees. Nothing. No figure. No movement. No sound beyond the storm. I searched around the side of the cabin for several minutes. The ground was covered in wet mud. Any person standing near that window should have left obvious footprints. There were none. Not a single mark. The mud beneath the window remained smooth and untouched. Eventually, I returned inside. The empty ground should have made me feel better. Instead, it made the entire situation harder to explain, because I knew what I had seen, or at least I thought I did, and if nobody had been standing outside that window, then I had no idea what had been looking in.
The same time every night after the second sighting, I started paying attention. Not obsessively at first, just enough to satisfy my curiosity. The man had appeared in the same location twice now, standing beside the mailbox across the road. Both times it had been after dark. Both times he had remained motionless for long periods. Both times he had disappeared before morning. It was strange, but not necessarily alarming. At least that's what I kept telling myself. The third appearance happened 4 nights later. I noticed him shortly after 9. There he was again, standing near the ditch beside the mailbox. The same posture. The same stillness. The distance and darkness made details difficult to distinguish, but the silhouette looked identical. I watched him for several minutes. Nothing happened. No vehicles stopped. Nobody approached him. He simply remained there. The following night he returned. Then 2 nights after that. Eventually I realized a pattern was forming. The appearances weren't completely random. The man almost always arrived after dark, usually between 8:30 and 10. And whenever I looked outside later in the evening, he remained exactly where I had first seen him, watching, waiting, or at least appearing to. As the weeks passed, I found myself checking the road more frequently. Sometimes I would glance through the front window while making dinner, sometimes while brushing my teeth before bed. Other times, I would pull back the curtain in the middle of the night just to see if he was there. More often than not, he was. The consistency began bothering me, not because he was doing anything threatening, because he wasn't. Human beings rarely stand still for extended periods without a reason, yet this man seemed capable of doing exactly that. One Saturday afternoon, I mentioned him to my nearest neighbor. The man lived about half a mile down the road. We were talking near our mailboxes when I casually brought it up. "Have you ever noticed someone standing out here at night?" I asked. He looked confused. "What do you mean? The guy near the road? What guy? The one who's been showing up after dark?" My neighbor shook his head. "I haven't seen anybody." I laughed slightly. I figured somebody else would have noticed him. "Nope." The conversation ended there. At first I assumed he simply hadn't been paying attention. The road wasn't particularly busy. Most people stayed indoors after sunset. Still, his answer stayed with me. A few days later, I asked another neighbor. The response was similar. Then another. Same answer. Nobody seemed to know who I was talking about. Nobody had seen a man standing near the mailbox. That was when doubt began creeping in. Not because I thought I was hallucinating. Because I started questioning my own observations. Maybe the darkness was playing tricks on me. Maybe what I thought was a person was actually something else. A fence post. A shadow. The next evening, I intentionally stepped outside to test the idea. The air was cold and still. Across the road, the man stood beside the mailbox, clearly visible, definitely human. I stared at him for nearly a minute. The shape was unmistakable. Person, not a shadow, not a trick of the light. A person. Yet when I looked around at the surrounding houses, every window was dark. No one else appeared to be watching. No one else seemed aware that a stranger had become a regular part of the landscape. The isolation of that realization unsettled me. For the first time, I wondered whether the man appeared only when I happened to look. The thought sounded ridiculous, yet I couldn't dismiss it. Night after night he returned, always after dark, always in roughly the same location. And every time I saw him, the same uncomfortable question entered my mind. If he had been standing there so often, why did nobody else seem to notice him at all? Closer than before, after a while, seeing the man became part of my nightly routine, not in a comforting way. More like a habit I wished I didn't have. Every evening, sooner or later, I would find myself looking through a window toward the road. Sometimes I did it intentionally. Other times I caught myself doing it without thinking. And most nights, he was there, standing in the darkness, motionless, silent. The strange thing was that his presence no longer bothered me as much as the uncertainty surrounding him. Nobody else seemed to notice him. Nobody knew who he was. Yet he continued appearing with almost impossible consistency. Then I noticed something that changed everything. One Thursday night, I was locking the front door before bed when I glanced outside. The man was standing near the mailbox. At least I thought he was. I looked away briefly to switch off a lamp. When I looked back, something felt wrong. I couldn't immediately identify what it was. Then I realized the distance seemed different. The figure wasn't standing beside the mailbox anymore. He appeared several yards closer to the house. Not dramatically closer, just enough to create doubt. I stared for several seconds. Eventually, I convinced myself I was mistaken. Darkness can distort perspective. Objects often look different at night. The next evening, however, I experienced the same feeling. The man appeared again. This time he seemed to be standing near the edge of my driveway. I frowned immediately. The location wasn't exactly the same as before, not by much, but enough to notice. I remained at the window for several minutes. The figure never moved. Eventually I stepped away. A few minutes later I checked again. He was still there. The following morning I walked outside and examined the area where I believed he had been standing. There was nothing unusual. No footprints. No evidence. Nothing. Over the next 2 weeks, the pattern continued. Each appearance seemed slightly closer than the one before. At first, he stood near the road, then near the ditch, then near the beginning of the driveway. The changes were subtle, so subtle that I repeatedly questioned myself. Was he actually moving closer? Or was I becoming paranoid? I started paying closer attention. One night, I sat beside the living room window for nearly an hour. The man remained in place the entire time. Not once did I see him move. Not once did he take a step. Eventually, I got up to use the bathroom. The trip took less than 2 minutes. When I returned, the figure seemed closer, not dramatically. Just enough to trigger that same uncomfortable feeling. I remember staring through the glass, trying to understand how that was possible. The movement never happened while I was watching. Only afterward. Days later, I noticed him standing near the fence surrounding part of my property. That was the moment genuine fear entered the situation. The fence wasn't close to the house, but it was unquestionably closer than the mailbox, close enough that I could no longer dismiss the progression. I walked from room to room, checking different angles. The figure remained visible from every window facing the front yard, silent, still, watching. At least that was how it felt. The next morning, I measured the distance in my head while standing outside. The fence sat significantly closer to the house than where I had first seen him. There was no denying it anymore. Something had changed. Yet the strangest part remained the same. I never actually witnessed him approaching. Not once. I never saw him take a single step. Never saw him cross the road. Never saw him move from one position to another. Every new location appeared only after I looked away. The realization became increasingly difficult to ignore. Sometimes I would stare at him for 10 minutes straight. Nothing happened. Then I would leave the room briefly. 30 seconds later, he seemed closer. The pattern repeated often enough that I eventually stopped trying to explain it. Instead, I developed a new habit. Every night before bed, I checked where he was standing. And every night, I hoped he wouldn't be any closer than before. Because with each appearance, the distance between the man and my house seemed to shrink, and I couldn't stop wondering what would happen when there was no distance left at all. The security footage, by the time the man reached the fence line, I stopped trying to convince myself that everything was normal. Whether there was a reasonable explanation or not, I needed to know what was happening. The uncertainty had become worse than the sightings themselves. So the following weekend, I bought security cameras. Nothing elaborate. Just a basic system with motion detection, night vision, and cloud storage. I installed one above the front door, another overlooking the driveway, and a third facing the road near the mailbox. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of relief. Whatever the man was doing, the cameras would record it. At the very least, I would finally know whether my memory was playing tricks on me. The first few nights produced nothing unusual. Cameras captured passing cars, stray cats, and tree branches moving in the wind. The man never appeared. I began wondering whether his absence was connected to the cameras. Then, on the fourth night, I received a motion alert shortly after 10. My stomach tightened immediately. I opened the app. The front camera recording began. The image showed my yard illuminated by infrared night vision. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then the man appeared, not walking into frame, not approaching from the road, simply appearing. The recording started with him already standing near the edge of the property, motionless. The sight sent a chill through me. I replayed the clip several times. No matter how carefully I watched, I couldn't determine where he came from. The recording began with an empty yard. A second later, motion detection activated, and there he was, standing perfectly still. The next few nights brought more footage. Every recording showed the same behavior. The man appeared somewhere on camera, then remained motionless. Sometimes for 20 minutes, sometimes longer. The clips became increasingly unsettling. Not because he did anything threatening, because he did almost nothing at all. One recording lasted nearly 30 minutes. The entire time, the man stood beside the fence, completely still, no pacing, no shifting weight, no visible movement, just standing, watching the house. At least that was how it seemed. I began reviewing the footage obsessively, frame by frame. Looking for details I might have missed, I noticed something strange. The recordings never captured him arriving. They never captured him leaving. The cameras only showed the period in between. One clip would begin with him already present. Another would end with him suddenly gone. The transition itself never appeared. At first I assumed the motion detection settings were missing something. But after adjusting them several times, the results remained identical. The camera always seemed to miss the most important moments. About a week later, I reviewed a recording that still bothers me years afterward. The alert arrived around midnight. I opened the footage expecting another clip of the man standing near the fence. Instead, he was much closer, standing near the driveway. The infrared image made details difficult to see, but he appeared to be facing directly toward the house. For nearly 15 minutes, nothing happened. The man remained perfectly still. Recording almost looked frozen. Then something changed. Slowly, the figure raised his head. The movement was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was enough. My stomach dropped, because he wasn't looking at the house anymore. He was looking directly at the camera, the lens, the exact position where the camera was mounted. I remember replaying that moment repeatedly. The movement looked deliberate, intentional, as though he had suddenly become aware he was being recorded. For several seconds he stared straight into the lens, and then he took a single step sideways. Only one. The motion was smooth and unhurried. The moment he moved beyond the edge of the frame, the recording ended. I immediately opened the next clip. Nothing. The yard was empty. No sign of him. I checked every camera, every angle, every recording from that time period. The man never appeared again that night. The footage showed him stepping out of frame, but it never showed where he went. That was the part I couldn't understand. The cameras covered the entire front of the property. If he had walked away, one of them should have captured it. If he had crossed the road, there should have been evidence. There wasn't. The final frame simply showed him looking directly into the lens before disappearing from view. And despite hours of reviewing the footage, I never found a single recording that explained what happened after that. The porch, after the recording of the man looking directly into the camera, I stopped sleeping well. Every small noise woke me. Every creak in the house made me check the security app. I told myself I was overreacting, but deep down I knew something had changed. For months, the man had existed at a distance. Near the mailbox, near the road, near the fence. Close enough to be unsettling, but far enough to feel separate from my life. The footage changed that. Seeing him stare directly into the lens made everything feel personal. It felt as though he knew I was watching him. Somehow that knowledge made the house feel less secure. Several days passed without any new sightings. Cameras recorded nothing unusual. No figure, no movement, no alerts. The silence should have reassured me. Instead, it made me nervous. Because every time the man disappeared, he eventually returned somewhere closer than before. I couldn't stop thinking about that pattern. One night, shortly after 2 in the morning, my phone notification woke me. The sound jolted me upright instantly. For a moment, I sat in darkness trying to understand where I was. Then the screen illuminated. Motion detected front door camera. My stomach tightened. I opened the app immediately. The live feed loaded. At first, I thought I was still dreaming. A figure stood on my porch, not near the driveway, not near the fence, not near the road. On the porch directly outside the front door, the image froze me in place. The infrared camera showed a pale gray silhouette standing only a few feet from the entrance. Motionless. The same posture. The same stillness. The man. For several seconds, I simply stared at the screen, unable to process what I was seeing. Then adrenaline took over. Jumped out of bed and grabbed the flashlight. I kept beside the dresser. My heart was pounding. Part of me wanted to stay upstairs. Part of me wanted to call the police immediately instead. I rushed toward the staircase. The entire house felt strangely quiet. No footsteps, no sounds outside. Only the pounding of my own heartbeat. I reached the front hallway and looked through the narrow window. Beside the door, nothing. The porch appeared empty. I blinked several times, confused. The camera had shown someone standing there only moments earlier. I unlocked the door and stepped outside. The night air was cold. A light rain had fallen earlier in the evening, leaving the ground damp. I swept the flashlight beam across the porch. Nobody. The yard beyond was empty. The driveway was empty. The road was empty. The silence felt unnatural, as though the entire world had paused. I moved carefully across the porch, looking toward the fence, then toward the mailbox, then toward the road. Nothing. The man had vanished. A sudden feeling of vulnerability settled over me. For the first time since the sightings began, the distance was gone. Whoever had been appearing outside my property had reached the house itself. The realization was difficult to ignore. Then I noticed something near the front. Steps. I lowered the flashlight. Mud. Several muddy footprints crossed part of the porch fresh. The rain earlier that evening had left the ground soft enough to create clear impressions. I crouched beside them. The marks were unmistakable. Someone had stood there recently, very recently. The footprints led toward the front door, toward the exact spot where the camera had captured. The figure, I followed them with the flashlight. A few steps, then another, then another. The trail continued, crossed part of the porch, and then abruptly disappeared. No clear exit path, no obvious direction. Just a handful of muddy prints ending near the entrance. I remember standing there for several minutes, scanning the darkness, listening, waiting. For movement, nothing happened. Eventually, I went back inside and locked every door in the house. Then I checked them again, and again. The security footage proved the man had been on the porch. The footprints proved someone had physically stood there for months, had been dealing with uncertainty, questions, doubts, possibilities. Now those doubts were gone. For the first time since I saw him near the mailbox, the threat felt immediate, because whatever had been watching from a distance was no longer staying at a distance. It had finally reached my front door. The last recording after the night on the porch, I expected things to escalate. I expected another sighting, another notification, another muddy footprint somewhere around the property. Instead, several nights passed without incident. The cameras recorded nothing unusual. No movement, no figure, no sign of the man. Then, just before dawn one morning, I received one final alert. Still half asleep, I opened the recording. At first, I couldn't understand what I was looking at. The camera wasn't facing the road. It wasn't facing the driveway. It was aimed along the side of the house. For several seconds, the image appeared empty. Then I saw him. The man was standing near the corner of the property, motionless, silent, not looking toward the front door.
Looking toward the cameras.
Looking upward, I followed his line of sight. Directly toward my bedroom window, same bedroom where I had been sleeping only moments earlier. A cold feeling spread through me. The recording lasted less than a minute. The man never moved, never looked away. Then the clip ended. There were no additional alerts, no footage showing him leaving, no explanation for where he went. and that was the last time I ever saw him. The sightings stopped completely after that. Months later, I sold the house and moved away. Nothing unusual happened again, at least nothing I could prove. But even now, years later, every place I live has security cameras. Not because they make me feel safe, it's because they remind me to pay attention. Sometimes I think about that final recording, about the man standing in the darkness looking up at my bedroom. Oh, and the thought that still bothers me isn't that he might have broken in. It's that he never tried. Maybe entering the house was never the goal. Maybe standing outside my window was enough. Maybe all those months, from the mailbox to the porch, he wasn't showing me what he was going to do. Maybe he was showing me what he could do. And once I understood that, he didn't need to come back.